Hello everyone. In this session, we want to talk about DNS zones. A zone is a portion of a namespace. On the screen, we have an example of a namespace. wcontoso.scontoso.econtoso.contoso.com, with contoso being the main domain. So we would have created a domain. We would have called it contoso.com. And then we would have created some child domains, which would be the wcontoso, scontoso, and eastcontoso. Now, in each of these domains, we can have zones. In one domain, we can have multiple zones. If we have a DNS server in Contoso, for example, that DNS server can be authoritative for more than one zone. So we can create a zone called W zone. We can create another zone called S zone and E zone. And all of those zones can be created within Contoso of itself, or within each domain, we can create a single zone. Remember that the zone has the resource records for all of the names within that particular zone. When we install DNS for the first time, if DNS is installed on a domain controller, then that zone file or that zone database is stored within Active Directory. If we install DNS on a member server, that is a server that's not a domain controller, then that zone file or database is stored locally. What we want to concentrate on in this session is storing that DNS zone database in Active Directory. And when that is done, we refer to the zone as an Active Directory integrated zone. And that is the type of zone that we want to look at in this session. There are different types of zones. We have a primary zone. We can have a secondary zone. We can have the Active Directory integrated zone that we mentioned just now. We can have the reverse lookup zone, and we can have the stub zone. Active Directory integrated zone. Let's talk about that one. We have here two domain controllers. The first domain controller is going to send or replicate all its data to the second domain controller within the environment. Both of these domain controllers will replicate data to each other. By replicate, we mean that whatever data is in the database, the DNS database, for the first domain controller will automatically be replicated to the second domain controller. By default, Active Directory data gets replicated from one domain controller to the other domain controllers within the domain. Since DNS or the DNS zone will be a part of Active Directory, that DNS data gets replicated along with the Active Directory data. And that is why we call it Active Directory integrated. There's some advantages of dealing with an Active Directory integrated zone. besides the fact that the data gets replicated from one domain controller to the other without any administrative overhead, that means that the administrator does not have to manually replicate that data. If we had a situation where we had DNS maybe installed on a member server, then that zone file will get stored locally on that server. And what the administrator then would have to do is to manually set up replication so that the DNS information or data can replicate to what we call a secondary DNS server. But you don't have to do that if your Active Directory integrated again, because the data, the DNS data, will replicate along with the Active Directory data. So if you are dealing with Active Directory Integrated Zone, you do not need any administrative help. The administrator doesn't have to do anything extra. Therefore, we don't require any administrative overhead. Another advantage is that the Active Directory Integrated Zone data is secured. If you're dealing with the DNS Zone file or database that is stored locally on the member server, that DNS data is not secured. We're going to take a look at how we create a DNS zone within Active Directory. On the Server Manager dashboard, we want to click on Tools, DNS. We want to right-click on Forward Lookup Zones and select New Zone. At the New Zone wizard, we want to click on Next. And here we come to the zone types. Since we have Active Directory installed on this computer, by default, we're going to have an Active Directory integrated zone. Remember that once DNS is installed on a writable domain controller, the default zone will be Active Directory integrated, meaning that the zone data from the DNS database is stored within Active Directory, and that is our default. We also have options here of creating a secondary zone, but we will only need to create a secondary zone if we already had a main primary zone where the DNS database file was installed locally, maybe on a member server, and then we needed to manually replicate that DNS data to another server, and that other server would be called a secondary DNS server, where you would have the secondary zone replicated to this secondary DNS server. We want to go ahead and click Next. And at this point, we want to choose our scope, our replication scope. How do you want the zone data to be replicated? Do you want your zone data to be replicated to all servers running domain controllers in the forest? Or do you want the DNS server to replicate to domain controllers in this particular domain? Or do you want the replication data to go to domain controllers for Windows 2000 compatibility? And you also have a choice of specifically stating the DNS server that you want this data this DNS data to be replicated to, and that would be your fourth option. We're going to go with the default option for the replication scope, which is to all DNS servers running on domain controllers in this particular domain, contoso.com. So we're going to go ahead and click Next. We're asked for the zone name. And remember that the zone name specifies the portion of the DNS namespace for which the server is authoritative. And we want to type the name of the zone that we're going to give. And remember that the zone name is not the name of the DNS server. In a particular domain, you can have more than one zone, multiple zones. So we're going to go ahead and type the zone name. We're going to call it etechtraining.com. So in your lab, you simply follow the highlighted letters. Etech, ECH, training, .com. Then we click on Next to continue. And here we come to our dynamic update section. In this section, you have to choose the type of dynamic update that you want. What does dynamic update mean? Dynamic update means that, for example, when you type the name of a website, that data gets registered within the DNS database automatically. On your network, when you connect to a particular host or server or client, that data, the host name and the IP address, gets registered in the DNS database automatically. Now, once you have an Active Directory domain controller and you're doing Active Directory integrated DNS, then your updates will be secure. Because for the domain controller that has DNS installed, only secure dynamic updates that's recommended for Active Directory. And the option is available only if you have an Active Directory integrated zone. If you had a zone, simply a primary zone, probably you created the zone on a member server, meaning that it's not Active Directory integrated, where the data has to be replicated to a secondary zone, that data is not going to be secure. Only if you are using an Active Directory integrated zone will your data be secure. You also have the option of allowing both non-secure and secure dynamic updates. Or you have the option of not allowing updates at all. Depending on the circumstances, you will make your choice within your domain. We want to click on Next to continue. And at this point, you want to review your settings, the name of your domain, the type of Active Directory integrated zone that you want. And when you're sure that this is exactly what you want, you can go ahead and click Finish. Once you have created the zone, you want to look at it. You might want to make some changes to the zone. So we're going to expand forward lookup zones. We're going to expand the zone that we created, etechtraining.com. And we want to right click on that zone. And we want to click on properties if you want to make any changes. And here you see this is the properties of the zone, and we're on the General tab. While on the General tab, you can change your zone type by clicking on Change here next to Active Directory Integrated. And you're going to see the choices that you had when you were creating the zone. You can make a change. We could also change the replication scope by clicking on Change to the right of all DNS servers in the domain. That was the scope that we chose when we were creating the zone. We wanted to make a change here. We simply click on Change and we choose another type of replication here. We said that the dynamic updates will be secure once you are on a domain controller. So that's why you see secure only here. You have a choice though. You can click the down arrow and you see you can do either none or non-secure and secure. We want to pause a moment here to look at this option called aging. It's referred to as DNS aging and scavenging. Now, DNS dynamic updates add resource records to the zones automatically. But in some cases, those records are not deleted automatically when they are no longer required. For example, if a computer registers its host resource record and is improperly disconnected from the network, the host resource record might not be deleted. That will be the record that is the name of the computer, the IP address, that might not be deleted. And these records are known as stale records, and they take up space in the DNS database and may result in an incorrect query response being returned. When Server 2012 can search for those stale records and, based on the aging of the records, scavenge them from the DNS database, this is referred to as the process of aging and scavenging. It is disabled by default, and for the zone, when we click on aging here, we now can turn it on. So we will enable it for the particular zone. But before we configure aging on the zone, many people forget that we actually have to turn it on the server itself. So we're going to go to the properties of the server, turn on aging, and then we're going to come back here to the aging node right here and configure aging for the zone itself. So let's go back and click on secure updates because that's the one that we want. And we are here on the server itself in DNS Manager. So we want to right click on the server and we want to click on properties. We want to click on the advanced tab of the properties of the DNS server. And at the bottom left here, you see enable automatic scavenging of stale records. So this has to be turned on the server first. So we're going to say enable. And then we want to say apply and OK. So we're back now to setting up this agent for the zone itself. So we want to click on aging. Now you see it's turned off by default. We have to enable it, scavenge stale resource records, by clicking in that checkbox. Now aging is determined by using parameters known as the refresh interval and the no refresh interval. The refresh interval is the date and time that the record is eligible to be refreshed by the client. And as you can see here, the default is 7 days. And then we have the no refresh interval. That is the period of time that the record is not eligible to be refreshed. By default, this is 7 days. In the normal course of events, a client host record cannot be refreshed in the database for 7 days after it is first registered or refreshed. However, it then must be refreshed within the next 7 days after the no refresh interval, or the record becomes eligible to be scavenged out of the database. A client will attempt to refresh its DNS record at startup and every 24 hours while the system is running. So we can choose to leave the 7 days here, or we can change the interval. We're going to go ahead and click on OK to close the zone agent and scavenging properties. And we want to turn our attention to name servers. We're going to click on name servers. And we have dc.controlsol.com. And the name server would be the server that is authoritative for that particular zone. You can always add another server here. You can edit the server or you can remove the server. Click on OK to close the box. And we have come to the end of our creation of DNS zones. I want to thank you for listening.